Today we're going to be installing a timing kit on a 2007 Saturn Vue. It's a Honda J series engine, J35. We're going to be replacing the water pump, the timing belt, idler pulleys and the tensioner pulley and the hydraulic tensioner. Now, what are the signs of a failing timing belt or water pump? Now, if your timing belt is failing, you might hear like a clicking sound while your engine's running. So that's something you can notice without taking it all apart. Once you've taken it apart and you've looked at the old belt, you can see maybe the teeth are worn or something like that. So there are a couple of signs that your timing belt is gone. Signs that a water pump is failing, well, your temperature gauge is skyrocketing because the water pump has failed, so that's number one. A leaky weep hole in the water pump. There's a little hole on the other side of the water pump, so when the bearing fails in the pump itself, so there's a bearing in here, there's a little hole that starts leaking water and you'll have a minor drip at the bottom of the car, and that's a good indication it's on its way out before it fails completely. And one more sign your water pump might be failing is that it might be making noise. When the bearing fails, you might hear like a shudder or something like that to indicate the bearing has failed. So there are a few signs your water pump might have failed. And when replacing the water pump or the timing belt, it's good just to get the kit and do it all at once. It takes so long to get access to these components that just buy the kit. It's about $60–80 depending on the make, model and year of the car, so it's definitely worth doing. You can see on this car here we do have a slight water pump failure. You can see this residue is coming down the when facing the engine, it'll be on the left side of the engine. That's where the water pump is. It lives up here and it's behind all these auxiliary cogs here like the crankshaft pulley, so it's really deep in there. But if you look underneath the car, you can see water just dripping around the pan here. That's most likely coming from the water pump out of the weep hole, which signifies a water pump failure. So we need to get that sorted before it becomes a bigger problem. Like I say, the car drives right now, but we don't know if we're going to get stranded. So whether you're experiencing these symptoms or not, it's good to change these components around 105,000 miles on this year, make, and model of the Saturn Vue. So around 100k is something where this process needs to be performed. So timing belt, water pump, and all the pulleys and the tensioner. So this is a bit of a long job. Here's the pump here. This all comes with the kit. We got camshaft seals, crankshaft seals, the idler pulleys, tensioner pulley, hydraulic tensioner with the pin set, timing belt itself, and you will need a couple of specialist tools. Here we have a socket for a Honda engine. This stops the crank pulley from moving when we try and tighten it back up, and this is a special socket. It's a 19mm. This is going to get our crank bolt off. You can see it's got a really thick wall, and that'll aid in removing that. Also, a cheap impact tool help the job go a bit faster. If you have a more streamlined impact, you will get in the tight crevices a bit better than a big one like this. And you also need some impact sockets, standard sockets, flex sockets, lots of extensions, and maybe even some cheater bars and breaker bars. Torque wrench helps for torquing it back down, and lots of sockets, lots of metric sockets. There's a few optional things here. Loctite. I do recommend Loctiting the bolts that were originally Loctited from the factory. You can tell when the bolt comes out, it'll have a little bit of dried Loctite on. It's best just to put that back on when assembling. I've got some penetrating fluid here, which is acetone transmission fluid 50/50 mix. Helps get stubborn bolts off. And I've got some propane for when that doesn't work, we can heat up the bolt and try and get them off. So that should be everything roughly you need to get started. So first thing we want to do is jack up the vehicle and place it on jack stands. You will need your jack later, so don't leave that under the car. Once it's securely on jack stands, remove the wheel and push it out of the way. Okay, next we want to do is just take this cover off. There's 6 little plugs here. So 2 down there, 2 there, 1 here and 1 there. So with those, just stick a screwdriver in and wheedle it out. That should let the first plug. Now once the top bit's out there, that puts the pressure off the second piece, and you can get your screwdriver behind the whole thing and pull the whole thing out from the car. So repeat that for all 6 of them. Okay, with all 6 plugs removed, this should just slide out the way. Now you can access the famous Honda crankshaft pulley, which is this guy right here. Right, the famous Honda crankshaft pulley, 19mm bolt, and it is on tight. So, for lack of tools, mainly air-driven impact guns, resorted to the most cowboy method. So, this is to put your thick-walled socket firmly on the bolt, make sure it's nice and firm. Push it against the lower control arm, which is this guy, and we're going to bump the motor. That involves just turning the key a tiny bit, and that will allow this to turn clockwise. That's the way it goes on this engine. And the breaker bar will hit the control arm and force the bolt off. On this car, the oil filter is very close, and we run the risk of damaging that. So I'm going to take that off, get a catch bucket, not much will fall, just so I don't break this while trying to get that off. I've seen many videos where I've seen these dented when people do this to take these off. So what we want to do is get this guy really firm on the lower control arm, almost so it's touching. I've removed the filter out the way here, so we're not going to cause any damage. And when you bump the car, literally just like that, it might help to get a second person here to do that, but you know, you don't need to. Important thing is to make sure this is really firm on there and it's firm against the arm. So inside the car, get the car all the way 2 notches over with the key, and we're just gonna literally bump. There. That's all there is to it. Alright, coming back round, taking the breaker bar off. Check that out. We're now in business. Again, last method, the other methods kind of suck. You're going to be here a few moments trying them, but they really are the safest option. If you really can't do it, bump the engine, make sure there's nothing in the way. I'm dogging anything, because the last thing you want to do is damage something else. So now we have that bolt off, we can wiggle this and get on with what we're about to do. Now the reason we got the crank bolt off first is because it's probably the crux of the whole operation. It's the hardest thing. Once you've got that off, you know you can proceed. It's nice having a crux early on, because you know where when you turn around your car's not going to be stuck all apart. So now that's all done, hardest bit out of the way, we're going to take this ductwork off here. So what you need, a flat head, that one right there, 10mm socket on this one right here. Okay, 10mm removed, outer clamp loosened. Loosen this clamp right here, again flat head, and then you can push this off. It's quite flexible, so by prying upwards you can pull it upwards. There's a little bung behind here which just sits in this hole here, so that just pulls out, and then from here rotate towards you like so, and once rotated just move this way and pull out. You can discard this whole piece to the side. Next we're going to remove the airbox housing. Clip here, clip over there, and that should just lift up and out. There's a couple of hinges on the back, you just whittle those. Good opportunity to clear your air filter here. So give it a shake, replace it, a few dollars, not that much. Next thing I'm going to do, attack this bolt right here. And like the other one, this one's a 10mm as well. With the bolt removed, just disconnect this sensor here. There we go. And now we can remove this airbox out of the way. There's a couple of rubber bungs in the front. If you just give it a whittle, it should come right out. Okay, with the airbox removed, we've got a lot more space to work with down here now. Before I forget, the next thing we can probably do is just put the oil filter back on. It was just a precautional step while we bump the engine. With these, you don't need to use a rubber wrench to get them back on. Really, they should be hand tight, otherwise you'll kind of ruin the threads in here. The Fram ones have a nice grip there, so it actually allows you to use your hand. So just almost as tight as you can with your hand, that's perfect. You want to get these off again. Now approaching some electronics over there. Here's the harness which goes to the ECM. So what we're going to do, we're going to remove the negative terminal so we don't short anything while messing around with electronics. So that's the next step. On the negative terminal, it's just an 8mm bolt. Take the terminal off, took it out of the way. So on this car, we're just going to take 2 bolts here. They're both 10mm. They're a little bit rusted, so you might need a little penetrating fluid to help get those off. Depending on the car, you might not need to remove this. You will have a much easier time just because it's 2 bolts. If you don't remove it, you'll see the mount down there is hidden partially by this, so you'll need some swivel sockets. For me, I'm just going to remove this out the way. You'll have more room and such an easier time, especially when getting the timing cover off and setting the timing and things. So that's why I'm taking this out. Now those 2 bolts have been removed on top. There's one more bolt there where this kind of silver extension bar I've put in it's kind of hiding. What you can do is just lift this tab here, push out here. This will disconnect this from the bracket, and you can just sort of slightly move it out the way. That will give you a tiny bit more access to get that last bolt off there. Alright, I've just pulled the whole assembly away from the bolts and I've just brought it over to the side. You can disconnect all these harnesses and move everything out, but I'm just going to play with it. So when I get these bolts, I can bring it here. When I get those bolts, I can push it back. That's all I need, just a little bit of room. I really want to remove as little as possible, but we have a good starting point now. So the next thing I'm going to do is take the serpentine belt off. These drive the auxiliary features on the car, AC, things like that. We'll need a closed end box wrench, it's 14mm. Just slip it over the tensioner here. There's a bolt, right, and just lift. And you can see it moving. That will take the tension off the belt, allowing you to slip a new one back on afterwards. So the tensioner just puts tension on the belt. You can see it right there. So lift that way, pull the belt off. Before you take the belt off, remember the configuration of the belt because you will be putting it back on the same way. So you can see here, it goes over the alternator here, underneath the tensioner, all the way across. Let's just pick that up underneath the car. So where we were before, it comes across from the tensioner, around the crankshaft, up over there. That looks like the AC compressor, so that gives you your AC in the car. So around the AC compressor. And from the AC compressor back up and over the alternator here. So that's your configuration. You just need to remember that, so when you put it back on, you know exactly how to do it. If you're reusing the serpentine belt, so you're putting the same one back on, make sure you put it on the same direction. Otherwise, if you put it on backwards, it can develop a bit of a squeak just because it's worn in. So it is a good opportunity to replace this if you need to. They're about $10, $15, something like that. So with the tension off, just slip it off the alternator and the belt will drop. If you only have a small wrench, use a cheater bar or something to get more leverage, because these can be quite hard to move. So now the serpentine belt's off, just give it a good inspection. If you don't know when you last replaced it, make sure there's no cracks, tears, worn channels, anything like that that might indicate a new belt. Once you've done that, mark it. If you're reusing it anyway, mark which way it went on so you can put it on the same way so you don't develop a squeak or anything like that. I'm using some white out, but you can use some white paint pen or something like that. Don't use marker, it tends to dry out, then you lose your mark. It's not important on this, but it is important when we get to the timing belt. I speak from experience with that. Now the belt's off, we can finally get this crankshaft pulley off. Really easy, you just wiggle it side to side with 2 hands. So now the pulley is off, the leaking water pump is more evident. You can see a lot more leak now. There's a key in here, don't lose that. Make sure that's in there. There's a plate as well. It's kind of hard to see right now, we'll get to that later. Make sure that stays on there for now. And just take the pulley off, set it aside. So this is what a motor mount looks like. This whole sort of package right here fixes the engine to the body of the car. That is all it does. They are very expensive. I have no idea why. It does have rubber insulators inside to promote dampening of the engine when it's connected to the car. So first things we're going to do is remove this mount right here. So that's 2 bolts. But before we do that, we're going to support the engine. Because we're taking the mount off, the engine will be slightly hanging on this side. With this vehicle, you can take it off and the engine will sit okay, but as a preventative thing on this car anyway, I'm going to put a jack underneath it. So with your floor jack here, just put a bit of wood on there so it spreads the surface area of the pressure. Last thing you want is this guy poking into your pan, might do some damage. And just support the left side of the engine. So we can just prop it under this pan right here and support it. So that is really all you need to do. It's just to support the engine. So now the engine's supported, take an 18mm socket and take off this bolt right here. It just faces forwards. This is the first one we're going to take off. So with the 18 removed, set aside, now we're going to take on these 2 15s right here. If the last bolt here is harder to remove, it probably means your engine's dropping or it's lifted too high, so it's putting the bolt at an angle. Play around with the jack and make sure it's straight, and the bolt should come out rather easy. It's a good job for an impact, these two. So the reason we took these two on afterwards is that when these two are off first, this whole thing tends to rotate when you take this one out. So it pretty much comes out like a dodgy bag of shopping, see? Yeah, so this is the engine mount right here. So now we've disconnected the engine from the frame, we're going to proceed with removing the supporting bracket right here. So it's a good idea to inspect these mounts, especially if you've got excessive engine rattling. You can see inside here, look at that. Totally come away from the surrounding body. So that means a new mount, which kind of sucks because these are about 100 off Rockwater. But I might go to Pick Apart and see if I can get a good one, or like a salvage jar. So yeah, good idea to inspect these. We've come a long way, so why not look at your other components. Alright, now we're going to start pulling the timing cover off. There's about 20 10mm bolts. One here, one here, one here, here, all the way around this black cover and also down here. So you can see underneath, here, there, and all the way up. Some in the middle too. I believe there's around 20, all 10mm. So at the front of the car there's a little green clip. Just pinch the behind here and pull that out. It's attached to the timing cover. Again, towards the back of the engine, it's a little harness just poked in here. You should be able to wheedle that out there and just set it to one side. It's all in the cover there. It just frees the electronics away from the cover so you can pull it out. Okay, with the first 5 or 6 bolts removed, cable disconnected like I've just mentioned there, should be able to slot off our first top corner, our timing cover. Now we're going to have our first look at the timing belt and the camshaft pulley. Let's continue. We're almost halfway there. It really helps if you have a slimline impact to get these out. Your job will go a lot quicker. Right, we're almost there. A couple of tips. A lot of these might be a lot rusted, especially if the water pump's been leaking on them. It really depends. A mirror helps just to make sure you're actually taking off the right ones. There are 10mm bolts right next to the ones which you don't need to take off. So a little bit annoying. So a mirror does help checking that you are actually getting the right ones off. Secondly, if they are really rusted, get a wire brush on the head first. The last thing you want to do is round off one of these bolt heads here, because you'll have to snap the timing cover and get a new one. I can't see a drill getting in there. So that's a couple of tips there, taking all those off. Alright, second cover's off. Just to get that big bottom one off now, and timing cover complete. So 17 bolts in total. That will take the full timing cover off here. Just pull it off top and bottom and we'll continue. Alright, take the little plate here off the crankshaft pulley, bolts around there. With this on, we can't get the belt off or get the new one on, so just set it aside and don't forget about it. The little rectangle key there can stay exactly where it is. Next, we're going to take off this motor mount support right here. It's a 14mm. There's one here and one just there. You can actually access this one through a little cool hole right there. So these bolts are on super tight. You probably need a good breaker bar to get those off. I've got a little cheater bar here from a bed. Works quite well. So you need a somewhat of a shallow socket to get access to this one. I guess that's why they put the hole through there, so you can use a lot of extenders to try and get it from over here. Yeah, so as the socket comes out, you will run out of room here, so we are using the hole. Clearly they've thought about this. And the last one we're going to get is this one. I don't know what's going on in here, a lot of rust and corrosion. We're going to clear that out and get this bolt off. I had to go sort of somewhat full cannibal on that bolt. It is totally seized on. I'll show you in a second. What I did, I got this tool, put it around the bolt and kept hitting it. That ward gave me a bigger hole in the plastic, but then I could sort of still use a washer until I replace what looks like this plastic part here. This bolt is totally seized on. Unreal. The drill wouldn't go through it. Crazy. Can't get a grinder in there, so you know, things like that happen. So in here is the last 14mm bolt in this hole here, and that should remove the motor mount bracket from the car. So with the motor mount bracket removed, we can access the water pump finally, which is this little nub right there. But first, we need to remove the timing belt. This is the bolt I was talking about. I don't know what that was, either an 8 or a 9mm back in its day before it got rusted. So we can probably get that out with some pliers now, and I'm definitely going to replace that one. So my little mini crisis is over. I hope yours isn't as bad. So yeah, I'm going to replace that. I'm sure I've got one in the house somewhere. But I do need a new motor mount, so I might as well pull it off the same car in the scrapper. Now let's get on with the timing. Right, before we take the timing belt off, this is a very delicate situation. What we need to do is get the timing at top dead center. Now what top dead center is, people abbreviate it TDC, is the point in which the piston in the number one cylinder position of your engine is at its highest point on the compression stroke. So we have to make sure we're at top dead center. What we do, we screw the crankshaft bolt back in, which is our 19mm here, which we bumped the engine earlier to get that out. We're going to put it back in. Obviously it's not going to be that tight. So now the bolt's back on, what we can do, we get our socket, slip it on the bolt, and we turn the engine over by hand. And this is how we get it to top dead center. This engine, clockwise only. Don't go anti-clockwise. If you overshoot, go all the way back round again. Now on these cogs, this is the crankshaft pulley cog. I'm just going to get some light on here. Right, this is the crankshaft pulley cog. You see this little arrow there? There's only one of them. If you go all the way around the cog, there's one little arrow. That has to line up with the arrow on the engine body. Now you see that little arrow there, just next to that ball? That's on the engine body. That tiny little arrow there, that has to line up with this arrow right here. So we're going to spin it until those two arrows meet. Now, this is the smaller cog. This timing belt also drives the two cam belts on the top. This one and this one. Because these cogs are bigger, for every 2 revolutions of the small crankshaft cog down there, these will spin 1 time. So if you spin this 1 time, these will move half the way around. So you may need to spin this round twice to also line these two up also. So on the rear cam sprocket, next to the firewall at the back here, this cog has a little line right there. That should be lined up with this line here. This is the one you should really go for. The one at the front, obviously this needs to be lined up too. The number 1 little mark here has to be in line with that there. It's really hard to see on this camera, but there is a little line here. I think that's harder to see, but as long as this one's lined up, this is just a sanity check just to make sure that's lined up. It should be fine, otherwise the car probably wouldn't run anyway. And then go back down and make sure this one's also lined up. So keep rotating this clockwise until all three are perfectly lined up. So yeah, as you can see, I'm turning it down here. You can see the whole mechanism rotate. That's pretty cool, huh? So it's hard to see with the camera angles. It looks way off, but if you go around, you can see that line meets up with this line underneath. Just there, the arrow meets with that arrow. So now everything's lined up. I'm gonna get our white paint marker and draw along here and across the belt. So mark the cog body if you wish, and the belt itself in all three places. So here, here, and also down there. So I've marked the belt. When you put a line all the way across, you can really see it lines up. And we're going to transfer these marks to our new belt. I really don't recommend using the same timing belt at all. If you really are going to use the same timing belt, maybe you've just installed it, put it on tooth for tooth. If you took this part of the rubber off this tooth, put that part of the rubber back on the tooth. So this is where the lining helps. Again, when you have a new timing belt, mark up the lines on the new belt against the old one, and we're gonna put it on the same way. That way, if all the marks line up and the ones down here, we know we cannot really go wrong. I've marked it in way too many places, but you know, things rub off. You know, if you accidentally rub that off, then what next? But yeah, so that's what we're doing. We've marked it all up in 3 places. I'm gonna now cut it off. It's a lot easier that way, just to cut it off and then carry on. Now, if you have something like a Honda Pilot with the exact same engine, you might notice your mount is slightly different, and you might also have a power steering pump around here. If you do have the power steering pump, it's just held on by 2 bolts. You remove the rear line, bung it up, and just push it out of the way. It's that simple. With the Saturn Vue 3.5, we don't have any of those extra things, so we can get cracking. So with the timing belt, notice the orientation. So it comes up over the rear cam sprocket, underneath the water pump, up over the right cam sprocket. Let's get down here over the right idler pulley, down under the crankshaft sprocket, up around the tensioner, and back. So put it exactly as you found it. So moment of truth, now going back now. Before you cut it, just notice the slack on here. You get a good indication of how tight timing belts are, and for some reason, if your new ones, or for whatever reason, no good, whether it's big or shouldn't be, just make a note of how taut it is. That's how taut your new one should be. Okay, so let's cut this off now. It's a lot easier. You might need some meaty pliers, but you'll get through it eventually. Okay, so the timing belt's been cut. Just be careful not to move these cogs now. They really should stay where they are for an easier time. If you do move them, just rotate them back to the markings on the back there. So we're just going to remove the timing belt. It's a little stuck on there. It's probably heated up so much, and it's quite old now that it is due a replacement. I don't believe it's been replaced. We're on 145,000, so we are a little overdue. With these little aluminium sleeves here, these keep the timing belt in when we're putting it back on, so we have an easier job doing that. So thank you, Honda, for that. Next, check your new timing belt against your old one. It should have the exact same amount of teeth. I don't expect you to count them, but just do a rough comparison of size. Next, an extra sanity check, it's also easier and you won't doubt yourself when you put the new timing belt on, is transfer these marks across to the new belt. So literally just overlay it, get your white paint pen and just match them all. That way when we put the new one back on, it's going on tooth for tooth, it's going to be way easier. Right, so I've transferred every single mark I made on the old belt, so when we put it on it's going to be way easier. Next we're going to start getting that water pump off. So the next thing we're going to do is remove the tensioner pulley. Not the auxiliary tensioner, but the timing belt tensioner. I've put my socket over the bolt you need to remove. So this is the tensioner pulley. It's the hydraulic tension, and next to it, we're going to take that off next. So this is a 14mm right here. When taking off some of this stuff, sometimes it's easier from the top, sometimes from the bottom. So again, this is the tensioner from the top. So with the tensioner removed, when they ship these kits, they don't always include collars, which is this little guy here. So you might need to transfer this over to your new one. If you don't have the full kit, it's good to inspect these pulleys. Sometimes your bearings might be gone and you might have wished you bought the full kit. So tensioner off. So the next thing we're going to do is remove the hydraulic tensioner. That's this little guy here. There's a 10mm bolt here, you can see I've loosened it, and one just underneath. It's a better view of that from underneath, right there. So there's two bolts, 10mm. Okay, so this is the tensioner pulley, this is the hydraulic tensioner, these are the old parts. What this does is pretty cool. This is the new part, it's preloaded with a pin. Once you remove this pin, this guy is going to shoot out, as you can see right here. Right? When this shoots out, it's hydraulic, so it's you know, and what can happen with hydraulics is they can leak. That's a sign of failure, so that's why they're included in timing kits. So this guy pushes on the tensioner pulley using this little nub there. You can see where it's been sitting, and that pushes the tensioner like this, and that tensions the timing belt. So that's exactly how it works. Some cars have these, some don't. I worked on a Vauxhall Mariva, it didn't have these, and I had to rotate the water pump in order to put tension on the timing belt. Total nightmare, but yeah, we're pretty set with these. It's quite a good system. So all the tensioners off. We're going to take this right idler pulley off now. That's this one right here. It's a 14mm bolt, and that should have Loctite on, so that's going to be really tricky. You'll need a cheater bar or something like that. So there's the right idler pulley. It's just a supporting pulley, it just rotates. These usually come with the kit, so you can replace this. Now the last thing, the moment you've been waiting for, the water pump, which is this guy right here. There are, I believe, 5 10mm bolts, one here, one there, and a couple more, one and one. I believe that's 5. You do have to make a decision before you pull this off, because when you pull it off, all your coolant's going to go gushing down there. Do you want to change your coolant? If you want to change your coolant, pull the water pump off. It's the quickest way to drain your car. If you want to keep your coolant, and that may depend on the quality of your coolant, check your overflow, dip in some paper towel, check the colour. Now these cars come with dexcool, which is an orange coolant. It's not a green coolant gone bad, so don't worry. So it's a dexcool. Tip of tissue, if it's a nice luminant orange, then I'd recommend keeping it. In that case, we're going to drain the radiator into a catch pan and reuse that coolant. So that is entirely up to you. So it's a bit hard to tell. With these overflows, these tend to get sun damaged or heat damaged, and they look brown. It's not a true representation of the liquid, so that's why I recommend dipping a kitchen towel or something white then looking at it. This looks perfectly orange to me, so I'm going to actually keep this coolant. So I'm going to drain the radiator. I'll show you how to do that now. So number one, get a catch can, come underneath the car where we've been the whole time. Look up towards the radiator, there is a little tap here, turn that to the left. That will allow all your coolant to seep out the little Cool little hole at the bottom there. Make sure your catch can is actually underneath it. So that's unscrewed enough. Now you see a dribble, go back over, take this off, I'll relieve the pressure, and then it'll start gushing out. Very easy, let that drain, it'll take a few minutes. So if you're unsure about the quality of the coolant, you can buy a coolant tester. It's got a little bubble in it, they're about $1 at Walmart, they're pretty cool. You can actually test the protection level of your coolant. It's pretty cool. I know for a fact this one's okay because I gave it a full flush a month ago, and you can see how neon orange it is, which is really cool. So we're almost finished draining, then we're going to pull that water pump off. I've got a couple gallon milk jugs there, so I'll transfer that into there so I can refill it afterwards. If you share your catch can with an oil change, make sure you degrease it properly. The last thing you want is to put coolant in oil residue. It's no good. So while that's draining, or you got any free time, it's good to degrease a lot of this stuff. I know when we pull the water pump, a lot of coolant's going to gush out, but we can get rid of some of this oil crud, especially from behind the timing cover. That way, if it begins to leak again, or we didn't do a proper job and it starts leaking, we can see exactly where this leak is coming from. It's hard to tell with all this crud on here. We can use brake cleaner, anything like that, and that will take that right off. One other thing, it's always good to clean thoroughly behind this timing cover. You don't want any debris in these sprockets. A little tip, a good degreaser is regular oven cleaner, $1, exact same thing. Get rid of all that oil crud off. Alright, once your coolant's pretty much finished, just tighten up this little tap right here. Alright, so now you've taken out the 5 bolts holding the water pump in, or 10mm. Just get a little pry bar and just pry it out. There's a couple little knobs on the water pump that just hold it in. It's pretty easy to pry it out. Move all your tools out the way because they're going to get a little micro gushing when this pops out. There it goes. And if you didn't drain your coolant, you'll get a lot more than that. So that's about it. There's the old pump. So first things first, always compare your parts. Make sure they're exactly the same, and that goes for every part we've taken off so far. I'm not going to mention that again, but do that. So let's look at the old pump. So a common sign of failure is worn bearings in the pulley there. They actually seem okay. The problem is there is the weep hole, which leaks coolant when it starts failing. It's down one of these channels. I think it's this one here. You can see it's a little bit gungy, which is a good indication that it has been leaking out of there. Another thing is the seal. So the gasket that goes all the way around here, you can see right here, that is enough to compromise the gasket. Just a little debris in there. I don't know how that got in there. But again, coolant can leak through here. It was a very minor leak. It was almost like the tiniest dribble, so I mean, it's really hard to say, but it's more preventative maintenance, to be honest, before the problem gets worse. So what we want to do now is get our new timing belt, get the gasket and push it in this groove here, and lubricate this gasket with a little bit of dexcool coolant, or whatever coolant you have in your car. That'll aid the seal when we press it back in the car. So sometimes pressing these gaskets in can be a bit of a pain in the ass because it feels like your gasket's too big, but really sometimes the gasket's smaller than the channel, so you really need to just follow it all the way around and press it in. It will go in. Then just wipe it all with coolant and then we'll push it in the car. Before we do that though, make sure to clean the socket where the water pump sat. Now if your water pump had a severe malfunction, you might have some crud, some nasty stuff in here, so sand it down, but with really fine grit sandpaper. It has to be fine. We don't want to scratch this mating area. Go all the way around the mating area because the water pump needs to be flush on there. And it also helps just to give it a good clean around, just to make sure there's no debris in there. So there's an example of some crud we need to sand down on the mating surface. So our new water pump's nicely installed there. Really rotates, it's in there solid. When tightening this, tighten the inside and then the outside. That helps it sit flush. So these two first, then tighten the outside, then go around them all again in that order, and that'll help it just tighten nice and flush without any weird indentations or anything like that. So the water pump's in, let's carry on with the next step. Now your timing kit may come with cam seals, crankshaft seal. The crankshaft seal is slightly bigger than both camshaft seals, so you'll see two are the same size and one is slightly bigger. This one's for the crankshaft, these are for each cam. What these do is stop oil leaking through the cam sprocket. That's what they're designed to do. With this engine, they rarely tend to fail. And again, if you replace them, the new ones have been known to leak. It's just what a lot of people have had experience with. I'm personally not going to replace them, but an instance where I would, if I could visibly see an oil leak through the cam sprocket, then I actually would replace them. If you wish to replace these, what you could do is slip a screwdriver in here to stop the cam sprocket from moving and then loosen this nut. Alternatively, you could put an oil filter removal wrench around the sprocket and undo this bolt, because when you undo the bolt, the sprocket will move with it. That's the reasoning for that. Then to get the existing seal out, drill into this part right here and then insert a wood screw, you know, like 3 revolutions, and then pull on the wood screw with some pliers, and that will help get it out. Clean the area, put the tiniest bit of oil lube around here and slot it back in. That's really how to do this. Again, I'm not going to do that, but it's fairly straightforward. And one more thing about installing these, they go the same way they came out. If you can get some pipe, maybe PVC pipe, and just put that over, yeah, it has to be the same size, over the diameter here, and just tap it in with a hammer. That will help seat this flush rather than it going in like that and potentially causing a leak. So a little bit of pipe, tap it in, and that's how you install those. And if you have a torque wrench available, these bolts are 8.8 foot-pounds. So this may look like a kettle full of boiling water. I actually stopped it before it started boiling, so it's actually really hot water. I'm just going to pour that down here. We don't want boiling water, we don't want to melt anything, but we do want to get rid of all the debris. And again, that's why I said use paint, because all this cleaning and making sure there's no debris in here, we can actually lose our markings, so that's why that's important. This gets rid of all the coolant that leaked out and anything that might degrade and cause problems later, so it gives it a nice good flush. And the bad thing about tap water, unless you boil distilled water, is that it leaves, there's lots of chemicals and various things in tap water. That's why you're not supposed to use it in your coolant system. So I'm just going to chase it with a little distilled, just to get rid of any chemicals, anything that might do damage later. So that's sufficient for me. I'm satisfied most of the debris is out of there. Now we can start assembling things back together. So we're all clean and dry down there. If you don't have an air gun to blow all the water off, use something like this. It's quickly evaporating. This will push the water away and then evaporate, so it's pretty cool. We're going to put our hydraulic tensioner on next, which is this guy. We're going to reuse the bolts, as mine didn't seem to come with any. Nice of them. It's going to be installed the exact same way it came off the car. If you're reusing this component, you will need to compress the hydraulic piece back into the device. You can see right there. So the aim is to get a small Allen key through this hole and through the hole in the barrel. You can use a vise. If you don't have a vise, a C-clamp. I think a C-clamp will work better because the hole goes beyond the lip. So a C-clamp will push that right in. Put a small Allen key in, then you'll have this pressed and ready to be installed just like this. If you had any stubborn bolts that you're regretfully reusing, I'd recommend putting some anti-seize on the threads. It'll help you get the bolts back out if you ever need to go in this area. Apart from the ones that originally had Loctite on, like these red ones, I recommend putting Loctite back on there because the factory did that for a reason. Right, the hydraulic tension is installed. Don't pull the pin. If you do, then you'll have to use the C-clamp method I told you just earlier about reusing the old one, and that will let you reset your pin. So next to go back in is our right idler pulley. It actually goes in that way. You can see the bolt has a washer on. If you try and put it in backwards, it doesn't sit flush, so that's how you know. So it goes in this way. The thread had a little Loctite on originally, so I'm going to replace that with my nice Chinese Loctite, about $3, so pretty good. If you don't have Loctite, don't worry, just crank it down. I believe it's around 33 foot-pounds. Alright, right idler pulley on. Check it spins free, because what can happen is you get the washer on the edge, so it's good to pull this out while tightening. So check it spins free, all installed. Let's carry on. So now we're going to install the timing belt. We're going to start at the bottom, the crankshaft, work our way up to the right. It's going to be hard holding the camera, but we'll give it our best shot. Okay, so the bottom first. You see how easy we made it for ourselves? There's no questioning that. So now we're going to go up. Going to go to the left of our right idler pulley, like so. Then over the right hand cam sprocket. Alright, so you have to pull it quite tight to get it over this sprocket. You'll know you're right because your existing marks will lined up that you transferred across. There's no denying that. And you can also see the tension's quite tight there. Tuck it under this little lip. I've mentioned it briefly earlier. That will hold it in place while you go around the water pump and the rear cam sprocket. So under the water pump and over here. Okay, so we're almost fully done. You can see these line up perfectly, these line up perfectly, and also down there we're still good. So we're just waiting on our tensioner to be put back in right here. So it all looks pretty cool. There is one of these lips here, just around the back, just there. So you just gotta poke it in and be mindful of that. So we're gonna install the timing tensioner pulley now. Transplant the little sleeve if you need to. It actually goes in the rear, so turn it over, put your sleeve in, turn it over, and that's what it should look like. The bolt will go through there like so. So we're going to put a tensioner pulley in now. So this is how it goes. We're just going to put that, it's just above the hydraulic piece there, like so, exactly where you got it from. Okay, you can see the tensioner pulley and the hydraulic tensioner in. When we pull that pin, that thing's gonna flick out and hit that black part on the tensioner and put the tension on the timing belt. Before you do that, check all your marks are still aligned, nothing moved, all the arrows, both cam sprockets. Once you're happy, pull the pin. And that is it. So now we've pulled the pin, you can see the tension is really nice on this belt. So when we drive the crankshaft bolt, everything will rotate. What we're going to do is rotate it twice. Once we've rotated the whole thing twice, so that'll be 4 times down here at least, check that all the marks still line up. If they don't line up, take it all off, reverse, repeat. It's very important you guess this right because this could be new engine time. So very important. So keep rotating, make sure everything rotates together, that's always a good sign. Alright, so I've turned it around about 4 times. Let's check our markings. So here's the line against number 1, that's in line. It's really hard to tell with the camera angle, but I'll bring it over here, you can see that. And over here, line and a line. And down the bottom, let's get that out of the way. That's in line, so I'm happy with that, that's good. Alright, I've transplanted my coolant back into into a gallon jug, and now I'm going to put it back in the car. We want to check for leaks at the earliest point possible, because the last thing you want to do is put everything back together and then find you have a leak. Alright, next thing we're doing is putting our mount support back on, the 3 bolts. I've managed to find a new bolt for that. I'm going to smother that with anti-seize because that's coming right out when I get a new motor mount installed. Alright, the motor mount bracket's all in, 3 bolts, and I've put in my little washer solution which holds it quite well till I get that replaced. So now put the motor mount back in. I appreciate this one is really damaged, but I'm going to finish through for you guys. Then I'm just going to take it back out. So same way it went in, that way, a bolt facing the front of the car. So this long one here had a bit of Loctite on. If you have some, put some on this one. These two, when screwing them down, make sure this is flush with the mating surface, which is the engine itself. So you might need to raise or lower your jack just to get that perfectly straight, and then tighten these two down. Okay, the engine mount's back in and installed. Next thing we're going to do is put our little plate back. We're going to have to take our bolt back off first, because we've been using that to rotate the engine. So take the bolt off first, 19mm. The plate goes back on this way. You can see the wears on the outside rather than, well, the outside but wider, but it is slightly flushed. It's smoother on the outside. So make sure your key is in there, the little rectangle. So we're going to put the bottom timing cover on. This goes first, before the top ones anyway. I've cut the bolts in anti-seize because these were a little bit stuck on mine, a little bit rusty, probably because the water pump was leaking a little, and they got some rust in there. I've cleaned off all the rubber and all the crud off the rubber gasket which goes around here, so it should be nice and smooth. Good thing about cleaning these down a little is if it leaks, then you can detect that without looking at a big pool of oil wondering where it's coming from. So we're going to put this back on the car. With these, if you've got really worn bolts, it's good to put the good heads in positions where it's hard to get to, so they're easier to remove. If you're reusing the bolts and you have a bad head, say it's slightly rounded, put them, say, at the bottom, because then you have more access and you can get a drill in there to drill them out if you need to. It's just a little tip. Alright, so the bottom timing cover's on. It's the 6 bolts there. Next we're gonna put the crankshaft pulley back on. So it only goes on one way really, the key lines up in that hole. Then we're just gonna put the bolt back in. This bolt gets tightened down to 47 foot-pounds and then a 60-degree turn. So pretty much just tighten it as tight as you can get it. So I've impacted it down. I don't have the best impact in the world. So we're gonna slot our tool now in like so. There's a bit of body that'll stop the tool from rotating just up here, so point it upwards, and then you'll need to get a 19mm socket, not a thick walled one because it won't fit, and really wrench that down. Use a cheater bar, whatever you have, and some extensions. Don't bump the motor to tighten it. Just don't do that. That could damage lots of things. So this is kind of what it looks like. It's a bit ridiculous, but it works, you know. So yeah, just crank that right down. You got your tool in there stopping it from rotating, so we're good to go. So now that's tight enough. You might need a pry bar just to pry that tool out there because it's a little wedged in. Just get a little pry and just work it from the left there. Alright, now that bolt's in, what we're going to do now is start the car. Just to see if it's running okay, you know, literally 3-5 seconds is all you need. If there's a problem, it's already apart, we can go and address that. Okay, so before we start the car, we need to pop this terminal back on. Had a little coolant spill, so I'm going to clean that up first, and then we're going to give the car a start. Alright, battery's connected, let's give it a go. Hey, that sounds good. Right, take the negative terminal back off. Let's continue putting everything back together. Now you've had your first successful car start, hopefully, fingers crossed. Check for any fresh coolant leaks. This ensures the water pump is not leaking. That is not fresh, I'll just let you know that now. But have someone over and just check it over here to make sure everything looks good. Once it's not leaking, put the timing cover back on, the top timing cover. 6 bolts in the front, 3 in the rear. The rear one is the one with the wiring harness. I've put anti-seize on my bolts just like the bottom panel. Right, timing collar fully on now. Sorry, there was 5 in the front, 5 in the back. The extra hole here was for this cable clip that we need to just pop back, and also this one at the back, just snake that cable back in its kind of channel all the way along. Alright, now that's all on, we're going to put this ECM back on its little harness here. So that's those 3 bolts. Okay, so we've got our ECM mounted back on. Just make sure it's pressed into its little plastics around. I put anti-seize on all 3 of the bolts because they're kind of rusted. Make sure none of the harnesses came disconnected when you were playing around with this, because that would be a big deal. Bring our little airbox sensor around, because that's one of the next things we're going to do. We'll plug that back in there. If you had a power steering pump that you moved out of the way, you can bring that back in and reconnect the line and attach that back in now. So belt part 2, get the serpentine belt back on. So we know our arrow is facing that way, so we're going to put it back on the exact same way. If you have a new one, it doesn't really matter which way you put it on. I replaced this about a month or 2 ago, so I'm going to reuse it. Okay, so the easiest way to get the serpentine belt on is to put it on the crankshaft, put it around the AC compressor, which is the bottom one way down there, and then just notch it up between these 2 pulleys. So when we move the tensioner over to the left, we can just move this hoop over the alternator. Very simple. Before you move the tensioner, just make sure it's perfectly aligned all the way around the crankshaft pulley, perfect, and also around the AC compressor. We don't want to damage the belt. Looks good to me. Okay, once you've done the tension and it's all snug, go around every single cog and double check it's on everything. So there'll be 3 cogs to check, and the tensioner just drives it like an idler, so you can ignore that one. So we're gonna put our airbox back in. There's 2 holes there. That's where these 2 little rubber plugs go. So start with that end. Once those line up, you can just push it down. Alright, so now the box is in. Pipe goes through the hole. 2 rubber things in there. Tighten the 10mm bolt down. Reconnect your airbox sensor just there. And then if you're reusing the same one, you know, bash it out. Get rid of some of the crap in there. Dirty side down. That's how you remember. And it only goes in one of 2 ways, so the little indentation goes in there. Now we're going to put the lid back on. Okay, so push the left side in first, tilt it. Once these kind of hinge things are in there, flap it down, tab, tab. Oop, there it is. And now connect the ductwork. So a little tip with this, so you don't have to bother with any of the throttle body, just put it in the car like that. So just sit it next to it and just rotate it left. So wheel it in. Make sure on the back of here there's a little rubber mount there that goes in that hole just there. So that's how you line it up. And then you can just press this into the airbox. Alright, flathead, 10mm bolt. Alright, now that's all together. Wipe down all your mess. I'm sure there's a little. Negative battery terminal back on, tighten it up. Next thing I'm going to do is start the car. Have a good look inside. See our belt spinning fine. There's no pinging, there's no crackling, there's no explosions. Sounds like a good job. It sounds a hell of a lot better than it did before. So what we're going to have to do now is purge the coolant. You can see we need some in there. We can use a coolant purging kit, or just keep letting the air out periodically. Push some in there, get your coolant all filled back up. Then you're pretty much good to go. Right, before we put any covers on, just have a good look around underneath, make sure there's no leaking, because it would be bad if it was. Yeah. The world turns on its axis. So I hope that helped you. Good luck with your project. You know, things don't always go to plan, but when they do, it's nice. It rarely happens. Yeah, so let us know how you get on. This was quite a nice project. It took about 7 hours with the videoing and editing and things. So for you, you might get it done a bit quicker. So yeah, thanks for watching. Awesome. And don't forget to put that guard back on. So drove down to the scrapyard today, got a new engine mount, well, new to me, not new, but I looked inside, I checked all the rubber, it looked really good, so I put it on the car, $8.25, they're about 100 new, and even then it's usually a Delco, so that's, you know, sort of GM parts to spec anyway. But I couldn't find any off-brand ones online. You know, you're at $100, so $8.25, good deal. And I got the bolt for free, so that's been replaced. So we're all good, yeah. So it's kind of awful finding broken parts when you've taken things apart, especially if you only have one car. So I'm glad it's all sorted now.